I'm going to be your moderator for the webinar today, and we have several guests who are going to be with us here today. We also, since we cannot see you in the webinar mode, we would really love to know a little bit more about who is on the line with us today. So I also hope that, Giselle, I do want to check in. Has everyone been able to select their interpretation? Yes, okay. Oh, and it looks like we have a question. Gisela, has everyone been able to select their interpretation? I'm checking. It looks like there's some questions about. Okay, great. Want to make sure that this interpretation is working for everyone. So as we get going, we really would like to know a little bit more about. Great, thanks, Gisela. Who is on the line with us? So please go ahead and chat in your name. If you are here as a part of an organization or a group, we'd love to know who you are here with. Maybe your location, where you're calling in from in the state of Colorado. And we'd love to know how you heard about this webinar. So please, as we get started here, please chat in a little bit, your name, who you're with, where you're from, and again, a little bit more about how you heard about this webinar. Thank you for joining us. So I'm just very quickly going to introduce our speakers here today, our panelists. We have 4 panelists that will join us here today. We're going to kick today's call off with Ashley Whelan, who's the Director of Public Policy at Hunger Free Colorado. And the first thing Ashley is going to do with us here today is just to kind of set the stage a little bit and frame up the conversation around what are the many different connections we see in terms of like actions and activities happening to advance and promote immigrant rights and those connections to actually improving healthy food access. We are then going to hear from JC Montoya Price, who is she is an advocacy director at Colorado Children's Campaign and is also part of the executive committee for the Removing Barriers Committee, Removing Barriers Coalition. The Removing Barriers to Certain Public Opportunities is a bill that has been introduced in the state legislature already this year, and JC will talk a little bit more about that specific bill and again, ways that it can help advance healthy food access. We will also hear from Raquel Lane Arellano, who's the policy manager of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, who will talk to us a little bit more about a specific bill, many bills that are going on this year, but specifically around a data privacy bill and how that important effort around data privacy and data sharing sort of relates to many other bills that have been introduced this session. We will also be joined by Nicole Savita, who is a policy director and co-convener of Project Protect Food Systems. And she will join us a little bit later in the webinar, right before she talks at about 9:40. So the only other last thing I am going to say before I pass it over to Ashley is just to sort of orient everyone to the many, many bills that have already been introduced this legislative session here in the state of Colorado. So, and we will be sharing these slides. So no need to write these down or remember them, but we will send these slides out. So if you're interested in tracking some of the many bills, as I mentioned, around removing barriers to public opportunities, to advancing farm worker rights, to data protection, and many other issues that you see here, we will send this out, and these are all hyperlinked to the bills so you can have ways to track these bills, more of which you're going to hear about here in a minute. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Ashley, I'm going to pass it over to you, and thank you all for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Wendy. I have the easy part. So going over a little bit of the context and where we're at in immigration policy. And I think the main word to start is hopeful. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for passing legislation at both the federal and state level to help immigrant communities have more rights and more access, and I hope immigration reform at the federal level and then in the near future. So in Colorado, we have some great legislation that the folks here are leading on and will speak about, and I think it's really important that a lot of these bills came out of community and community voices, and folks like you who just are participating today can have a major role in this work. As you can see, Raquel and JC and others are part of organizations that have supporters like you all and get input from folks like you all. Hunger Free Colorado is a member of CIRC, Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and we look to them for input on policy. I just wanted to give a quick, basically I'm going to share a document that I think shares that hope message with you all, that an organization that Hunger Free works with, Protecting Immigrant Families, put together. And that document came out of, has come since the rules have changed around people being able to access public benefits and what that means for public charge determination. So when families apply or individuals apply to become citizens, there's a consideration called public charge, like if that person or family has depended on or would need to depend on benefits. And under the prior administration, it was really made a lot stricter, and I would say problematic and racist, and really trying to take away people's access to nutrition programs by scaring them away from the programs and scaring families who have mixed status immigration away from the program. So I think I figured out how to do it. So I'm gonna put some documents, and actually I'll share, but I think I figured out how to do it. But it's basically the top 5 things to know about what's happened with public charge since no, it says internal error. There. So hopefully that's sharing.
It is not.
Okay, there it is. And I have it in Spanish too. I know it's the tech side is always interesting, but here I have to go through Google Docs to share it with you all. But I also have it in Spanish, Gisela, so that folks can look at it in Spanish too. Let me do my technology again in the Spanish version. See, I can figure this out. Okay. And I figured you all then could print these and take these with you for knowledge. Hunger Free is working on putting together a more Colorado specific document, but it's still in process. And my colleague Anya is on vacation, and I'm not going to share her work until she's ready for me to. So, but the top 5 facts on public charge that are really important to know since March, when the Biden administration pulled the rules that the Trump administration was using to determine what benefits folks can use. So SNAP and the other benefits that folks can use. And actually a lot of benefits don't require immigration. It require that you're a citizen. So WIC, the new pandemic EBT program, there are programs that all can apply for. But in the past, under the Trump administration, SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, was considered. So it's such a big win and such an important piece that it isn't considered anymore. And hopefully that can lift some of the fear for families. So I'd just say, look over these documents, but the first guide is public charge does not apply to everyone. So as you can see, refugees, which many folks are, asylees, survivors of trafficking and domestic violence do not have to meet the public charge test. Most public benefits do not affect a person's immigration status. And since March, when the new rules from the Biden administration went into place, well, basically pulling the Trump rules, these programs are not considered as part of public charge. So you can see really important is SNAP. And so folks can get those benefits if they qualify. Some folks don't qualify, but their family members may, and they can get those public benefits. And we hope that they will, because for us, access to food is an access to thrive and succeed. Three, only a few benefits are considered again. We're now going back to the pre-Trump rules, and those benefits are cash assistance, like SSI and TANF, and then long-term institutional care. But you can also appeal those if those have been utilized. So, and then those non-cash benefits, like I said, can be used by the family members and won't impact immigration status.
And Ashley, I don't know if you see the chats in. Were you intending to share your screen or just share in the chat?
I just share the documents in the chat so you all can take them with you. And the documents are from Protecting Immigrant Families. So if you want to go into that chat and you can see there's a Spanish and an English version, that's what I'm looking at. And then that your personal information is protected. Federal and state laws generally protect the privacy of people who apply. And I think Raquel is going to speak a little even more to that. The importance of protecting data at the state level and how we can do that even more at the state level, which our organizations like CERC are leading on. So I just wanted to set some context that we're in a hopeful situation that immigration status is less of an issue under this administration, and that they have stopped defending the rules that the public or that the Trump administration put forward, and that we are in a situation where these benefits are more and more accessible to families that qualify, and that hopefully folks will use them. And it really connects with the state level piece, and that making sure that in Colorado, we have the rights to get the benefits at our state level as well. So I just wanted to share that information and that great news with you all. And that's my setting of the context, and then hand it off back to Wendy, but off to the experts who are doing and leading us on the legislative work at the Capitol. And we support all the bill. Hunger Free Colorado supports all the bills that are going to be mentioned today. So thank you so much for all you're doing for the folks who are coming up next.
Thanks, Ashley. And I should add as well, Nourish Colorado has also endorsed all three of the bills that will be discussed today. And I think bottom line is anyone can reach out to any of our organizations to understand sort of our positions more, or how to get involved with advocacy work, which you're going to hear a lot more about these bills and how to get involved. So pass it over to JC to talk about removing barriers to certain public opportunities. Thanks for being here, JC.
Thanks so much for putting this together. It's so important because we know that hunger is a huge issue, and the confusing layers of state and federal regulations can make people really fearful, like Ashley was talking about, to access the benefits that they are eligible for. Senate Bill 199, and I'll share our fact sheet. I muted myself.
Oh, JC, there we go.
There is a bill that would remove some really anti-immigrant harmful legislation that was passed back in 2006 during a special session of the legislature. There was a threat that a ballot initiative would go forth that would severely restrict the eligibility of immigrants for various benefits. And so the legislature, with a Republican governor and a Democratic majority, decided to pass this bill instead. Thankfully, our state and our society has evolved quite a bit since 2006. And we now realize how harmful and damaging those bills were, which is why we're working to undo them, to repeal them. Basically what removing barriers would do is take that anti-immigrant language and restrictions out of state statute, which would then enable local governments and others to distribute their resources in the ways they see fit. Currently, the state regulations are even more restrictive than federal regulations in terms of what people are and are not eligible for. And unfortunately, the way the bill was written is very confusing, so that it's not clear to most local governments or the state government which benefits people are and are not eligible for. People have been refused library cards on the basis of this law, along with other much more crucial benefits. The The idea, I believe, in 2006 is that this would be saving resources, right? That people who were ineligible then would not get access to state resources because their citizenship would be verified. What we learned in the first year after the bill was passed is that it was extremely expensive and is costing millions of dollars to the state and local governments to verify legal presence in the state and in the country. This bill would allow folks to apply for grants, loans, contracts, and other public opportunities without the requirement of verifying legal presence. And what we know is that even when folks have legal status themselves, they may be fearful to share their documentation or their identity information because they are afraid of putting their undocumented family members at risk, or have uncertainty on how their private information, as Raquel will talk about later, will be used. We're very hopeful that this can help in a lot of ways. We know that a lot of COVID pandemic relief funding will be going straight to local communities. And we've heard from communities like Eagle County that they want to be able to support their residents of all immigration statuses. They see them as important members of their community, and so want to be able to help when there are both health disasters like COVID, but also natural disasters like fires or winter storms, things like that. It's important to note that this bill does not mandate provision of any benefits, but rather creates the opportunity, opens the door for local communities and state government to offer licenses and other benefits. For us at the Children's Campaign, the way we got involved is around childcare licensing. We know that childcare licenses are, the licensed childcare is becoming less and less available, and this bill prevents people without documentation from becoming licensed childcare providers. This would open the door for folks to become licensed and then increase the share of licensed childcare available across the state, particularly childcare that is culturally and linguistically relevant to the community. From a hunger and food justice perspective, as I mentioned before, the state and local regulations can be so confusing and contradictory that folks simply don't try to access the benefits that they're eligible for because it's unclear if they'd be putting themselves or their families at risk in some way due to their immigration status. This would take away the requirement to verify legal presence, and then have folks feel more comfortable accessing the benefits that they need to keep their families strong and healthy. In terms of the status of this bill, it had its first hearing on Tuesday this week and was laid over, which means they'll be considering it again next week, April the 20th, for a vote. There are a couple amendments that are being made to have it align more clearly with other immigrant rights bills that are being considered this session. And we're hopeful that the legislature will see how important this is. We're hearing more and more from local governments who say that this is essential. They need this red tape removed so that they can support their citizens, their residents of all citizenship statuses, and so that they can get things like, rental assistance or other benefits that would allow them to maintain their families. We really believe this is essential to create a Colorado where every resident can prosper because they have access to professional licenses that allow them to pursue their profession, but also to supportive benefits that'll allow them to get through hard times. In terms of a couple actions y'all can take, we are really hoping right now that folks will reach out to their local government officials, so your city council members and your county commissioners, and encourage them to sign on to this letter of support that I just shared the link for in the chat. What we know is that, yes, legislators listen to their constituents, and their constituents who have also elected power can be very influential. So the more we can get county commissioners and city council members to speak up and ask for this, demand this change so that they can better serve their citizens and their residents, the better off we are. For folks who are interested in a little more background on the issue, the Children's Campaign's podcast, The West Steps, featured this bill in a conversation with Lorena Garcia of Colorado Statewide Parent Coalition and Maggie Gomez, who was at the Center for Health Progress. And they talk a lot about both the history of this bill and the reasons why we're advocating for it now. So for those of you who like kind of the deep details, that will be helpful. In addition to reaching out to your local officials, of course, we need to make sure that the committee members hear us loud and clear that this bill needs to be passed, that this is important to our communities, to our health and stability and strength. So I am going to pull it up here somewhere in my links, and I can also share some draft language and the contact information for the Senate, State, Veteran, and Military Affairs committee members who will be voting on this at their meeting on the 20th.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, JC. So a lot more information and ways to get involved coming. And I should mention again to everyone on the line, we are recording this webinar. Every link that has been chatted in, all of the slides, we will share all of that as a follow-up. So lots more. If you're furiously working to track all the chats, don't worry, we will send everything to registrants as well. So JC, thank you so much for that. And we're gonna pass it right over. Oh, one more thing, Rick, I should say too. We are gonna have time for Q&A, but if you have questions that are just top of mind, feel free to chat them in as you think about them. Don't feel like you need to hold them. Chatting questions as you think of them, and we will track those and get back to them before we close. So Raquel, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. I am going to present my screen. So let me just get this up. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a few bills CIRC is working on. Can y'all see my screen? Awesome. Okay. For those of you who might not be familiar, CIRC stands for the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And we were a coalition founded in 2002. And actually, you know, our history of policy work is rooted in what happened in 2006. That was a year of many walkouts in the immigrant rights movement, massive walkouts across the state. And it was during those protests that legislators actually went back into the Capitol after coming out and speaking with community and helped pass those really harmful bills. So that history is very long, and that's when CIRC started to engage in policy change, you know, and we're a coalition across the state of members who help guide what we do and what we focus on. So these two campaigns are campaigns that our members, and I've seen a few members on this call, glad to have y'all here. Our members work at the local level to identify these campaigns and then lift them up. And those are what we focus on at the statewide level. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our campaign to create a statewide legal defense fund, and also our campaign to protect the data privacy of immigrants across the state and our statewide agencies. This first campaign is House Bill 1194. It would create a statewide legal defense fund and is really focused on building due process and dignity in our immigration court system, which operates in a lot of ways similar to the criminal justice system, but without access to proper representation or to an attorney. And so because there's no right to a guaranteed right to a lawyer, if you're in immigration proceedings, what we see is that 70% of people who are detained in Aurora, Colorado, at the private immigration detention facility do not have a lawyer. And they're facing an immigration system and in a situation, right, where the opposition, the government trying to deport them, always has a lawyer. And we know that it makes the reason we're fighting for this is because it makes a big difference when somebody has a lawyer by their side. We know that immigrants who are trying to present themselves in their cases pro se stand a very little chance of winning their case. And it's when people have an attorney, a qualified attorney, that they're more likely, 10 times more likely to win their case and 3.5 times more likely to be released on bond. And that's a really big deal, right? To be released, because immigration detention is indefinite in nature. You don't get a sentence for how long you're going to be in there, right? It's until you can be released on bond or have your hearing before the judge. So people are suffering the same consequences of our criminal justice system. And there's a reason why you have a right to an attorney in criminal court. It's because your life and your liberty is threatened. And that, you know, our belief in this system and fighting for universal representation is rooted in that same belief that if your life and liberty are being threatened, you deserve to have every chance to have a successful outcome, because that's probably going to be one of the most important cases of your life. And this fund will be for, basically, we've decided to allocate the fund in a certain way to make sure that people who are detained are prioritized. Because we know when someone is detained, they're not able to work to provide for themselves or their families. Getting access to legal information, you know, to prove their case is that much more of an uphill battle. And we know that they are, you know, least likely to have a lawyer because of the financial burden of being detained and the high cost of having an attorney. So most of the funds will be allocated towards detained defense, and folks will also have to be at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. And one thing I want to point out here that I think is really important is that in this bill, there are no criminal carve-outs, because like I said before, right, universal representation means that literally everyone deserves representation when they're in these kinds of situations. And that's a really important point, because the same issues of discrimination against Black folks in the criminal justice system exist in the immigration and the deportation system. Black immigrants are over-policed and also overrepresented in deportation. They're held longer in detention. Every negative consequence you can imagine that exists in the immigration system is disproportionately weighted against Black immigrants. And so that's why I think that's a really important piece of this bill. And the funds for this bill, so it's going to be a grant program that is administered through the state and will go to nonprofit legal service providers with qualified experience in removal proceedings of 3 years. And also organizations can partner with a nonprofit that's qualified. And lastly, nonprofits can partner with private attorneys if they don't have another option. Those last two options exist because in Colorado, there is a huge lack of legal services outside of the Denver metro area. And that makes it really hard for people in Summit County, for people in Fort Collins, for people across the state in Pueblo to get access to qualified attorneys who are able to provide, you know, really good care. In some of these places, they only have one local attorney. So, you know, they don't have the option of shopping around for a good price or looking around for, you know, someone who they really feel is going to be able to represent their needs. And we are hoping with these included pieces to build up infrastructure for legal representation across the state. Our sponsors are Representatives Carrie Tipper and Akita Ricks, and also Senator Moreno, incredibly strong and amazing sponsors who are working on this bill. All right, and I'll take questions at the end. The next bill is Senate Bill 131, which is our bill to protect data privacy. And in 2013, Colorado expanded licenses for all residents, regardless of immigration status. That was a huge community-driven process, and communities, at least communities really led that fight, you know, and they were able to pass SB 251, which creates a license program for anyone regardless of immigration status. And communities and nonprofits and leaders across the state have since been implementing that program and telling people it's okay, it's safe for you to get your license. You should be able to trust in this process. This program was created for you, so you can have a license and drive around and be protected on the roads. And since then, we've helped, not just us, but across the state, organizations have helped 150,000 people get their licenses through this program. And we started to notice that there were some concerning things happening, right? There was a family that got pulled over and ICE showed them their DMV license photo. And we had heard multiple stories like that, right? Of folks who were really concerned that ICE was able to track them down after they got, or renewed their license. And what we know is that ICE and our police are increasingly relying on surveillance and information sharing to track and detain folks, and in this case, it's immigrants who are being targeted. But we know that there's a lot of facial recognition technology being used, and also ICE will use literally anything at their disposal in order to be able to track and monitor where folks are, and that's really concerning. And so this bill is aimed at trying to solve a piece of this problem, but this problem is so much bigger for citizens and non-citizens alike. And so in 2020, we did a CORA request, which is a Colorado Open Records request, to find out what kind of information sharing had been happening between the DMV and ICE. And what we found was hundreds of emails between the DMV Fraud Investigations Unit and ICE. And what was alarming was, the DMV had been telling us that they were sharing some information with ICE, but only on criminal grounds, right? But what we found was not a single one of those emails had a criminal warrant, a subpoena, or anything to really verify criminal grounds. And they were all on the basis of immigration. And further, in half of the emails, it was the DMV employees in this investigations unit who were proactively reaching out to ICE. They had a very buddy-buddy relationship with a few ICE agents in particular. And so after those findings, and I'm happy to share articles that release those findings more publicly if folks are interested, but this is obviously a huge violation of trust that community members and nonprofits and organizations and trusted folks on the ground have placed in our government, and extended on to community. So we have worked since then with the governor's office, and we're able to get guidance issued in May that has largely stopped this information sharing. But we don't want to just rely on this administration, this governor, to make sure that our people are protected. We need something in statute, something in law that exists beyond this administration. So we are working on finding permanent protections, which is what this bill is aimed at doing. And so this bill would essentially say that, anytime a third party agency or a federal agency like ICE wants to get personal identifying information, they must have a warrant or a subpoena. They can't just get this information by emailing our state agents or employees. We also wanted to go further and protect our statewide databases, which are not included in the governor's guidance. So we want to rewrite those user agreements and make sure that if ICE does have access to our, say to a law enforcement database, that they aren't allowed to use it on immigration purposes. And we want to make that really clear in all of those database user agreements. And also we want to hold people accountable, because one of the hardest things for our community members is that, we do have a lot of interfacing with the DMV because community members are actively helping folks get these licenses. We have contacts with the DMV that we're talking with all the time. And what was really heartbreaking was there was no way to hold people accountable when we found out what had happened, and so there is going to be up to a $50,000 fine for employees who intentionally violate personal identifying information. And yeah, we're really excited about this bill. It's sponsored by Senator Gonzalez and also Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez. And I did fail to mention where both of these bills are. House Bill 1194 has passed out of its first committee. That's the Legal Defense Fund bill. We are waiting in appropriations in the House. And Senate Bill 131 also passed out of its first committee with bipartisan support, which is incredible. We got Senator Simpson in Alamosa to vote in favor of the bill, and that is also waiting in Senate approps. So as soon as the budget moves this week, we should be seeing some movement. And I will stop sharing my screen. I'm going to drop a few links in the chat to sign on to these campaigns. If you'd like to support, we are going to have some calls to action soon, but would absolutely love for y'all to sign on. If you have an organization, you can sign on and support, or if you want to sign on as an individual, you can also support in that way.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Raquel. And just a reminder as well, because there are a lot of resources coming at you all right now, we will collect all of these and send them out to everyone, of course, with the recording and slides from the call. So I see our fourth panelist, Nicole Savita with Project Protect Food Systems, has joined us to talk about the Ag Worker Rights Bill. I do also see that there's a couple of questions that have come in. Thank you so much. Please keep chatting in questions. As you think of them in the chat or the Q&A, we will get back to them after we hear from Nicole. And I just wanted to share one comment as well that someone added in when you were speaking, Raquel, about not only ICE investigating undocumented individuals, but also citizen activists in immigration. Yeah, so pretty widespread. So thank you so much. We'll get back to your questions. And Nicole, welcome. And please just dive right in and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I'm slotting this in between so many other meetings and presentations today, actually. And of course, as is wont to happen when you're trying to do too many things at once, my computer crashed completely about 10 minutes ago, and I lost access to the bilingual file for the slides that I had in front of me. So I have my English only slides, and I'm very sorry about that, but happy to follow up later today with plenty of materials to support the bill that are bilingual or Spanish language first. Am I able to share my screen? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So I'm here to speak about another bill that actually I've had the pleasure of working with Raquel on as well, and having CERC support for here from Project Protect Food Systems Workers. We are working on trying to get SB 21087, the Agricultural Workers' Rights Bill, passed this session. One of the things that I've heard about this bill as we've moved it through from legislators and from even folks in the governor's office is that the bill is so big and there's so much in it, and it's too long and we can't read it. And so the answer to all of that is yes, it is very big and there's a lot in it, and it's very ambitious. In fact, because agricultural workers have been excluded from so many of the protections that others, workers in almost all other sections of our economy enjoy and have enjoyed for a long time. So I'm gonna very rapid fire run through what is in the bill. Because it is so big, we've created a number of documents, and we have a whole supporter toolkit with English and Spanish versions of a lot of those documents and explainers. And Wendy, I'll make sure that you guys have access to that to share out so that this is less like drinking out of a fire hose in 10 minutes. So our prime sponsor in the Senate is Senator Jessie Danielson, who's just been very, very fierce in her pursuit of making this bill into law, and Representatives Karen McCormick and Yadira Caraveo in the House. The heat hasn't turned on them yet because we are still in the Senate awaiting appropriations. I heard last week, so we've made it out of committee. It was assigned to the Business, Labor, and Technology Committee, and we're successful in getting out of committee. Senator Moreno, who is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, is actually signing on as a sponsor as well. So we don't anticipate much trouble in appropriations, and the bill only has a very small fiscal note. So we believe that we will be headed to the floor of the Senate. Just a quick bit of rationale and timing on this bill. It's really important to note that agricultural workers have been left out of the most basic workplace protections That includes wage protections like minimum wage and a right to overtime, but also things like meal and rest breaks, even though they perform some of the hardest labor in our economy and most essential labor. And very critically, the right to collective action, which yes, means the right to unionize and collectively bargain, but it also importantly just means working together. So it means that agricultural workers, one or two or more of them who go to an employer to raise concerns about safety, to raise concerns about the way they're managed or treated, to ask for better pay, any of those things, they can legally be retaliated against for doing that. And they can be fired or subject to adverse employment action for doing anything more than just acting on their own. And so the lack of a right to collective action is much broader than even, the fact that they can't or don't unionize. It's really important to note that these exclusions are very much linked to institutional racism and economic inequities that go back hundreds of years. We've got lots of documentation and research on how these exclusions came to be in the federal law, and then how they were kind of copy and pasted over state, over state, over state, and the legislative history of very racist representatives in the House of Representatives in the 1930s, really talking about their desire to have these carve-outs from New Deal era legislation in order to maintain racial hierarchies in wealth and in income and in social standing. Now, that was originally anti-Black racism and designed to maintain the structural power differences of an originally enslaved agricultural workforce. Over time, that has come to function as a form of oppression of many Asian immigrant groups that came and worked in agriculture, and then increasingly Latinx immigrant groups that dominate the agricultural workforce today. So in some respects, we see this as one of the kind of paradigmatic intersectional examples of structural racism in the US that just is so overdue to be uprooted. And then of course, during the pandemic, we deemed our farm workers essential, but continued to treat them as expendable, continued not to provide them with those same basic protections that other workers in Colorado had. So we really feel like this is one of those moments where the time is right. So what would the bill do? We would remove an exemption from the Colorado Labor Peace Act such that agricultural workers in the state would be entitled to organize and join labor unions, engage in that protected concerted activity, and engage in collective bargaining. This piece of the bill is critical for long-term power building and changing the dynamics that exist in workplaces today. And I'm very sad to report, some of you may have seen in the news over the past couple of days, that an agricultural worker in our state died at a dairy in LaSalle at the very end of March. He chemically asphyxiated and drowned in a manure pit the first time he was operating a piece of very heavy machinery at the edge of that pit, and the machine, there was some form of malfunction. We don't know if it was user error. We don't know if he blacked out from the chemicals, that off gas. We don't know if there was a malfunction, but in any event, the machine he was operating lurched into the manure pit, and he drowned in it because you become immediately incapacitated from the hydrogen sulfide. And so folks have asked me, as I've spoken with lawmakers, with the media, various experts, if our bill could have prevented that, if the law had already been changed. And I argue strongly that yes, in fact, it could have, because Juan Ponzo Tamaxle, who died, was operating a piece of heavy machinery in a dangerous situation for the very first time. He was being trained on it by a coworker while he was using it. And if you were in a workplace where you could speak up about unsafe conditions, or felt that you had the power to say, hey, I'm not quite ready to do this yet, I need a little bit more training, the whole dynamic might have changed, right? Or if coworkers had been able to say there's no barrier there between where we work and where this hazard is, and there should be a fence, there should be something else. You know, we can't know in an alternate history, but it does really seem to me that workers are made vulnerable because of the lack of collective action. The bill would also remove an exemption from our state minimum wage laws to make sure that all farm workers, regardless of the size of the farm they work on, are entitled to make Colorado minimum wage. Right now, many workers do already make over minimum wage. Many of our employers pay more than that in order to be competitive in the market for labor. But the problem is that not all workers are guaranteed that. So there's a lot of variability, and we believe that minimum wage ought to be the minimum, the actual minimum someone can be paid for their labor. Critically, it would also create an elevated Colorado minimum wage for herders who perform open range herding of livestock. And this is something California has already done and set at an even higher level. But these are people who work 80, 90 hours a week, really around the clock, completely alone in the most remote places. And even at this, they might not on an hourly basis actually make minimum wage, but they would make a much better wage. Just moving really quickly, we are working on establishing overtime through the bill, that we're promoting a rulemaking process that would help figure out how agriculture is a little bit different and what we need to do to get sensible overtime for agricultural workers. Meal and rest breaks. We just want these breaks to be consecutive. Right now, workers are entitled to them, but they can be given in 1 to 2 minute increments instead of 10 minutes at a time. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in my garden for several hours, I need to be able to sit down and drink some water and cool off for at least 10 minutes. So the idea is that these breaks would be consecutive. We want to guarantee and codify a right of access to service providers. Key service providers would include the kinds of service providers listed here: healthcare providers, community health workers and promotoras, education providers, attorneys, know your rights, legal advocates, government officials and consular representatives and members of the clergy, and make sure that agriculture employees have the right to entertain these visitors, also to turn them away, of course, but to entertain the visitors where they live, because many of them do live on employer provided housing, and we have ample evidence of tremendous restrictions being placed on workers' access to all these people. And then a set of extreme overwork protections. So when the temperature reaches or exceeds 90 degrees, we're talking about pretty hot out, and people who are working outside, we believe that workers should have access to at least 1 quart of fresh, cool water per hour of work. And that water really needs to be cool, because when you're hot, drinking water that is also hot neither cools you down nor feels particularly appealing. And in California, where they've already done this and where they've studied it extensively, they found that not requiring the water to be cool was actually increasing the incidence of really damaging heat stress injuries, and so therefore causing a whole series of domino effects. We're asking for open air shade provided in an area that's large enough for workers to be seated without being crammed in and having to touch each other to be in the shade and get out of the sun. I'm told by folks at the United Farm Workers Union that they've also got this in Colorado, and they've had tremendous success complying with these by having employers buy like $40 shade tents at Costco and they sandbag them so that they're they're more impervious to the wind. They put the coolers under the shade tents and everybody's fine. Unfortunately, we're getting a ton of pushback from farmers that like this is a bridge too far and it's impossible to set up. And I think like compliance at best is probably going to cost about $200 for the season. So I'm exhausted by the kinds of battles we're waging in here. We want to make sure that workers get more frequent rest breaks when the temperature is high. So those 10 minutes would come every 2 hours instead of every 4, and some training to recognize the signs of heat stress. And then there's a series of provisions such that if the governor were to declare another public health emergency, agricultural employers would be required to provide some extra protections and increase safety precautions for workers. So this is just designed to be preventative, little more flexible. We're not just planning for another COVID type emergency. prohibition of the short-handled hoe, which has been prohibited in California since before I was born, sometime in the 1970s, but also in more conservative leaning states like New Mexico and Arizona and Texas. So we're really lagging behind here. We don't want people to have to work in a completely stooped over bent position for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And also just creating a state level agricultural worker advisory committee to continue looking at these issues and making sure changes to the law are having the intended effects. This is also just intended to create a formal path for future inclusion and participation in the public process, and some robust enforcement provisions. So I know I'm over time and I'll stop there. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to do questions about all of the things, but I will share some additional information through Nourish so that we can make sure we get you action items, and just really anyone who wants to support. We have Action Network letters set up to go both to the governor and to your legislators. And right now, you know, the industry is organized, lots of ag lobby groups who are well organized to oppose, and we just really need to amp up the visibility of support that exists in other groups and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to Oliver. Thank you, Gisela, for being here and doing all the simultaneous interpretation, and JC and Ashley and Raquel, Nicole for being here and presenting. So we do have a couple of questions that come in, and also to everyone else who's on the line, please feel free to chat in the chat box or the Q&A, any questions you have. And I also, silly question maybe for Amber, who understands the technology better. I see a lot of people join via phone, but they are not able to unmute and ask questions. Is that correct?
I believe they can, Wendy.
Okay, so if you are, thank you. If you are on the phone and are able to unmute yourself, please do feel free to do that and ask questions. And everyone else, if you would chat in, that would be great. And I just also just want to personally thank all of you for raising and surfacing so many of these issues. Here at Nourish Colorado, our focus is on equitable access to nourishing food, and so many of the things that you surfaced here today around equitable access to basic benefits and services and resources and rights are so critical for food access, right? We know that the way people make decisions around food is one of many, many things you're making a decision around every day. You're balancing lots of things in your household budget, and food, and sometimes healthy food, are things that get compromised. So everything you've raised here today is so fundamental to making sure that each and every person in the state of Colorado has that power and the resources to make sure I also don't have to compromise on feeding me, myself, my kids, all the healthy food that we want. So I just want to say thank you all for raising these issues, and a couple of questions that are coming in. And I see Nicole, thank you, are chatting in some resources and action items. Thank you so much. Again, we'll email these out to everybody. So Raquel, there's one question that came into you that I chatted into you. Do you want to just go ahead and address that?
Yeah, absolutely. We will be sharing fact sheets afterwards. I actually only have PDF files, so I'm not able to drop those in, but I'll make sure Wendy has those to share out. The second question was, for data privacy, would that be a problem for people who are applying for benefits too? Even if the benefits are not on the public charge list, are people still afraid that that data could be shared? And would that be the case? That is a very valid question. I think why it's so important to get this bill passed this year, especially in a year where hopefully we will also pass Senate Bill 199 and open up avenues for benefits at the local level. One of the things we discovered in the governor's guidance was that there was information hotspots or areas where information was being shared where we didn't know before. So one in particular is CDLE, which happens to also manage unemployment insurance. We saw that that was also a really big hotspot for information sharing between ICE and a local state agency. And so that has largely been stopped, right? And we've met with that department and talked about protocol and ways to make sure that that's not happening. But yes, absolutely. I think this is something that needs to get passed in order to make sure that we are protecting all information that is held by our state from getting into the hands of ICE and other agencies like that. And we really want to be able to assure folks that their information is safe, and so we're trying to make sure that that information is protected, right? Like the last thing we want to do, and the last thing our communities want to do is share false promises to folks that their information is 100% safe, and so I think that's a really valid question, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that we protect all information that's held by the state.
And I would just add to that, like there's a bill actually that we're not talking about today, but to help immigrants get access to unemployment. And when you're pointing out that was an issue, it's like, yes, we want to do proactive policies to help folks who need these resources, and then protect their data too. I'll throw in that bill too, because I didn't know that, Raquel, and wow.
That's great. Thank you, Ashley. And we have, as you've all seen, an incredible wealth of resources in the chat, and we will organize these by sort of bill and exactly what kind of resource it is before we send them out. And Gisela, I wanted to check in with you. I know we're about 1 minute to the hour, but Gisela, are there questions that have come in that you see? Great. Okay. Thanks, Gisela. Thanks for doing this. So it's right at 10 o'clock. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you that I cannot see in webinar mode. Thank you so much for being here. Lots more to come. Any of the panelists, is there any sort of final word or anything else you didn't get a sneak in you want to say? All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Have a really wonderful rest of your Thursday. And there's a lot of action we're about to take together. So thanks for taking the time. Be well, everyone.